In topic 13, we're going to talk about the spiritual life of a number of the religious orders within the Roman Catholic Church that come about in the medieval period. So we're going to talk about the Cluniacs, we're going to talk about the Cistercians, and then end by talking about the Franciscans and, of course, the Dominicans, since Albertus Magnus College is a Dominican college. It's a Catholic college in the Dominican tradition. And unfortunately, a lot of students go through uh, Albertus Magnus College and get a degree and have absolutely no idea who the Dominicans are, who St. Dominic is, and the importance of uh, the Dominican order in the history of the Catholic Church. So we're going to talk about all of that here in this lecture. First of all, we're going to talk about Cluny and the monastery at Cluny, which was established in the year 910. At Cluny, you have a group, for lack of a better term, of monastics known as the Cluniacs. That does not sound as bad as it is. That was just how you would refer to the monks at Cluny. The monks at Cluny, the Cluniacs, were trying to reform monastic life. They were Benedictines, the original monastic movement, if you remember, goes back to St. Benedict and to the rule of St. Benedict. But at the Abbey of Cluny in France, this group of Cluniacs decided they wanted to do things a bit differently from the regular Benedictines. One of the strange things that makes Cluny so unique is that when it comes to that concept of libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church from secular authority, Cluny took this so far. The abbot of Cluny took this so far, and the monks at Cluny took this so far that they were free not just from secular authority, from oversight of local secular authority, but they were also free from the oversight of the local bishop, which was an unusual, unique situation. In fact, the abbot of Cluny doesn't report to the local bishop, which would be the norm. The abbot of Cluny reports directly to the pope. Now, that makes the abbot of Cluny a fairly powerful individual, and in fact, that would make the abbot of Cluny, whoever it happens to be, more powerful than the local bishop. Well, because of that, the abbot of Cluny was, or the monastery, the Abbey of Cluny, in France, was allowed to experiment a bit more with monastic life and spirituality. Now, when we get into the medieval period, spiritual life had really fallen off dramatically in Benedictine monasticism. And one of the big ideas in Benedictine monasticism and in a lot of monastic movements is this phrase, less is more. You're probably familiar with this phrase because professors are constantly telling students when they write, remember, less is more. More is not more. Just because you say more doesn't mean you really have anything to say. The best thing you can do is cut down everything you're writing, everything you're doing, and just get to the point. Because the point and the arguments that support your point are what matter, not a bunch of flowing, flowery words that sometimes often have no point. And this was basically how many people approached the monastic life, is less is more, except for the Cluniacs, who said why. Why is less more? Perhaps spirituality is really based on more being more. So as you can see, they're going to start taking everything up a notch, which is, I wouldn't necessarily call it a perversion of the original understanding of Benedictine monasticism, but it's certainly not where Benedict thought things should go. So what does it mean if you say more is more? Well, you continue focusing on the daily office, the liturgy, the Opus Dei, that prayer 8 hours a day, from morning prayer all the way to evening prayer and nighttime prayer and in between. But what the Cluniacs decided is, we want to step things up when it comes to the art and architecture of our monastery. This meant if you're going to have a chalice that contains wine, which becomes the body of Christ, shouldn't that chalice be gold? If you're going to have a chalice or some type of object or container that contains the bread, which becomes the body of Christ during a Mass, during a Eucharist, shouldn't that be gold? Shouldn't there be elaborate art and stained glass windows? Shouldn't the place where we worship and pray, instead of it being simple, shouldn't it be ornate and beautiful and grand? The Cluniacs also ordained an elite choir of monks, just sort of professional ordained elite singers to chant the liturgy. And why not? The idea was, if we are here to worship God, then it should be done in the best possible way. And many of these choir monks, they would read and they would sing Latin and they would chant the liturgy in Latin. And this is a very sort of old school medieval way of celebrating Mass and celebrating the Eucharist. It's not something you would see really in modern Catholicism. Because of the Cluniacs, monasteries also became these huge agricultural centers and created a large amount of agricultural economies. Even today, this is why a lot of monasteries produce all kinds of organic food and have organic gardens and all this other stuff that they do, going back to the Abbey of Cluny, because this is something that they realized is, not everyone's going to engage in manual labor, but we might as well do some of this and then sell our products. And you see this today. I've kind of joked about this a bit, but you see this today if you go and you go to a package store or something like that, and you're looking at all the different kinds of alcohol. If you look at some of the premium beers that are there, you will notice that some of these premium beers that many people have never heard of are still produced by monks in Europe. Well, as you can imagine, there was a reaction to what was happening at Cluny. This more is more did not sit well with all monks and all monasteries. So there was a group of monks known as the Cistercians, also known as the Trappists, who in 1098 said, what Cluny is doing is ridiculous. The Cistercians, the Trappists, focused more on that reditus ad fontes, that return to the sources. And so for them this meant, well, we're not only returning to the Bible, but we should return to a more literal reading of the rule of Saint Benedict. And if you read that rule, it very clearly says less is more, not more is more. The Cistercians weren't just reacting to the Abbey of Cluny, they were also reacting to increased clericalization. They were reacting to the power of the papacy and the power of local bishops. So they wanted everyone to return to the sacred work, every monk to return to the sacred work of manual labor. They didn't like this idea of, why do you have certain people set aside to be part of an elite group of choir monks? That doesn't make any sense. What they wanted to go back to was poverty and simplicity, the kind of thing that Bernard of Clairvaux talked about, that learned ignorance, wisely unlearned. The Cistercians had their monastery of Cîteaux, also in France, and here's where we get Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we've already talked about, is an individual that was not only going back to the sources, but in some respects was anti the intellectual tradition. And because of what was going on at Cluny and Cîteaux, you eventually get two really important groups in the medieval period that are not necessarily breaking away from the Benedictine monastic tradition, but they're taking it and then taking it into a new direction. They're redefining it. And what we get here is we get the Franciscans, who take their lineage obviously back to St. Francis, and we get the Dominicans, who take their lineage all the way back to St. Dominic. Now, the Franciscans and the Dominicans were not in competition with one another. They were basically saying the same exact things, but the means of getting to the end were different. The Franciscans put more emphasis on evangelical poverty, the spiritual life. The Dominicans thought, well, you get to the end result more through education. Franciscans, if you really want to categorize this movement of monks, they were mendicant. And what I mean by that, they were mendicant monks. What made them different, let's say, from the Cluniacs, is that they traveled a lot. So did the Dominicans. They didn't just stay within the abbey and pray 8 hours a day. They went out into the world, which is what it means to engage in a mendicant life. And this is really part of what's just happening in the world at large. It fits the world at large. As we talked about a few lectures ago, there was an agricultural revolution with crop rotation in Europe. There was commercial revolution, there was urbanization. So it made sense for monastic movements to rethink how they work and how they operate, especially outside of the monasteries. So from 1181 to 1226, there is a man named Francis of Assisi. And as with many stories of great religious figures, Francis is going to reject the life that his father had set up for him. Francis's father had worked in the textile industry. It was very wealthy, prominent individual. All of this could have been given to Francis of Assisi, but he rejected it. In fact, one of the stories about why he wears these brown burlap sacks is basically as kind of a reminder of his previous life, but he's also rejecting that life as well, because he could have worn anything he wanted to wear. He could have worn these very ornate garments, but instead he chose very simple brown garb to wear. Well, Francis of Assisi starts to have all of these spiritual experiences, one in 1205 and one in 1208. And what all of these experiences show him is that, and if you remember that icon I showed you, is he feels that God is calling him to rebuild his church. And a lot of what Francis ends up doing is trying to reform a church that has become too ostentatious, too wealthy, too obsessed with power. He's not trying to create a revolution. He's not trying to destroy the church. He's not trying to split the church. But a lot of what Francis is concerned about are things that we're going to find Protestant reformers being concerned about with the Catholic Church. In fact, Francis and even Dominic both are creating their own reform of the church, but they're doing it from within, which is always the option you have as a reformer. You either reform the church from within, or you create a revolution and you split the church apart. The Franciscan order becomes an order because Pope Innocent III breaks all the rules in 1210 and allows it to become an order. It's a complicated process that we don't need to get into, but in many respects, new orders were not something you often grant a blessing to, but Innocent III, after meeting with Francis, is completely okay with saying, we can have a new order. And the Franciscan order is based, its spirituality is based on being evangelical. That means returning to the sources, returning to the gospel, the simplicity of the message of Jesus. It's ecclesial, meaning that it is ultimately subservient to the church and obeys the church. One of the key features of Franciscan spirituality is poverty. Hence, Francis and Franciscans down to this day wearing very simple clothing. That brown burlap type of sack is their clothing of choice. And it was also incarnational. And what I mean by that is that it put a great deal of emphasis on God becoming flesh. And if God becomes flesh, which is what the incarnation means, then that means that we should care about the created order around us. And so you would often see Franciscans and Francis himself praising God for creation. One of the great famous prayers of St. Francis is, brother sun, sister moon, that nature is our ally. We are not against nature. We work together with nature. There's no contempt for the world anymore, because the world is good because God created it. So those four things, evangelical, ecclesial, poverty, incarnational, are all part of the Franciscan order and its spirituality. It's very simplistic. It's mendicant, meaning it's going out into the world from all of the monasteries and things like that. It's not just staying closed within the monastery and praying 8 hours a day. It's out there among the people. And also, one other thing I should add, this word mendicant, it doesn't just mean that you travel around, but it also means that you rely on God to provide you with shelter and with food. If you're mendicant, you don't just travel around, but you also rely on the goodness of others to give you shelter and food, which often means that you as a Franciscan have to beg other people for that food or for that shelter. And if you happen to get food from somebody from begging or shelter from begging, then that you interpret as a sign of God's grace. If you don't, well, then you move on. And again, this is the Franciscan order thinking back to really kind of how the disciples and Jesus worked in the gospel stories. Along with the Franciscans came the Dominicans. And St. Dominic of Guzman, has a very similar story to that of Francis. In fact, they were, again, not competing with one another. They were wanting to do the same things, reform the church, but the vehicles through which they wanted to do it were different. Dominic came from a lot of wealth and power. He could have been a very, very wealthy, powerful individual like his father, but he rejects all of that. He forms an order known as the Dominicans. The Dominicans are also called the Order of Preachers. So if you see a name like here at Albertus Magnus, you might see a name, comma, and then O.P., the letters O and P. O.P. stand for Order of Preachers, which means the Dominicans. And sometimes, a lot of times in the Catholic Church, you'll see letters that may not make any sense after a person's name. And what that usually refers to is not an academic degree that a person has earned, but it refers to a sort of ecclesiastical designation. The Dominicans put a great deal of emphasis on learning and on preaching. In fact, they created all kinds of manuals for how to preach. What they really wanted was an educated clergy that knew how to preach. So even though they believe in all the things the Franciscans believe, the evangelical poverty, being mendicant, begging for food, all that sort of stuff, the big difference between the Dominicans and the Franciscans is that the Dominicans really emphasize education. Part of this is because Dominic Guzman, St. Dominic, whose years are 1170 to 1221, was not only concerned with missionary activity, preaching the gospel to people, but he was very concerned with heresies and heretics that were causing problems for the church. And he thought the best way you confront heresy in the church is by educating yourself. First of all, learn your own tradition and learn it really, really well, and learn what the heresies are doing and learn how to confront it intellectually. And Dominic and the Dominicans were very, very successful at this. And again, they believed that part of the reason why heresy had spread throughout the church so much had to do with an uneducated clergy. And again, out of the whole Dominican line, you were going to get amazing intellectuals like Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, who did a lot for science in the medieval period, who also taught Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian of Roman Catholicism. And that's also true down to this day. I mean, some of the movers and shakers in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Roman Catholic theology were all Dominicans, like Yves Congar and de Lubac and so many others. Or not de Lubac, Chanute and so many others. You've probably heard and maybe not known what it means, but the spirituality of the Dominicans exists in this phrase, contemplata aliis tradere. And this is one of the pillars of Dominican spirituality that is incorporated in one way, shape, or form here at Albertus Magnus College. What that statement means, and it's a very, very important statement, and it's one statement that is one Latin statement I would ask you to remember, is it means that you pass on the fruits of your contemplation. This isn't about going out into the wilderness or the desert like the Desert Fathers and having a mystical experience and then coming back and telling people about that mystical experience. What this phrase means is kind of you go to a library, you study, and then you take the fruits of what you study and bring it back to the community. And you teach other people the fruits of your knowledge, the fruits of your learning. Now, the Franciscans have a similar idea, but it would be based more on spiritual experience, not intellectual experience. And so what you kind of have here with the Franciscans and the Dominicans is because you have people like this in the Roman Catholic Church, I think, and in all churches, is you have a group of people that gravitate more to the mystical and the spiritual, and then you have people that gravitate more towards the educational and intellectual. And both of those are recognized as okay and good things in Catholicism. Because remember, it's never either or, it's both and. So it's not Franciscans versus Dominicans. It's that both of these are okay. It's just that some people gravitate towards one and others towards the other. So the Dominican movement is monastic, but it's also apostolic. It's itinerant in that it wants to move around, get out of the monastery, and preach the gospel, and in the case of Dominic, confront heresies and heretics that are causing problems in the church. It focuses a lot on priestly education, priestly formation, because the sermon is so important. And basically, the intellectual pattern, and this is contemplata aliis tradere, is study, contemplation, all of that leads to preaching. And Dominic and the Dominicans thought if you have better preachers and better preaching, you could educate the people in the pews. And this would lead to a very strong church that was capable intellectually of finding the truth, finding God, and also intellectually confronting heresy.